Alrighty, so we're continuing our discussion of the New Deal. In this module, we're going to be looking at some of the alternative voices of people who were against the New Deal or had other ideas about the New Deal, and then how the New Deal is received um, by the different demographics in the United States. So, one of the first critics of the New Deal is Father Charles Coughlin. He was born in 1891 to Irish Catholic parents. By 1926, he has set up a radio program, excuse me, um, and basically what he does this for, basically he's a radio priest, but he is pushing for social justice, and his church is targeted with a burning cross, and as a result of that, he starts to get involved in um, kind of spreading his idea of social justice. um, he's a New Dealer in the beginning. He supports Roosevelt, but over time he begins to speak out more and more about the fact that Roosevelt is being too cozy with big business and bankers. And so he launches this National Union for Social Justice, which is an organization advocating for um, other tactics to use in order to bypass the New Deal. He feels like the New Deal is catering too much to corporate America and not enough for the average American. He picks up kind of an anti-Semitic message by 1936, where he's siding with Hitler and Mussolini, and so he begins to pop up on the national radar. And by 1942, the federal government has revoked the National Union for Social Justice's nonprofit status in terms of mailing. And so they're beginning to move against him. The government is moving against him, basically. So keep in mind, by 1936, you've got the rise of Hitler and Mussolini. There are a lot of Americans who support Germany and Italy because they feel like Germany got the raw deal in terms of reparations and in terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And they feel like Hitler is trying to kind of, quote unquote, teach Europe a lesson, which many Americans were okay with. Keep in mind, America never passed the Treaty of Versailles. So it's not unusual for someone to be professing these beliefs. Unfortunately, it's against an entire group of people, specifically the Jews. And so finally, in May of 1942, the Catholic Church basically tells Coughlin, you need to shut up. And so he does. Otherwise, he's going to get defrocked. But unfortunately, a lot of Americans did support kind of a nationalistic approach for Germany and Italy, largely because of their treatment through World War One. Anyway, Huey Long is another kind of critic of FDR. He creates his own program called Share Our Wealth, which was basically wealth redistribution measures funded through taxes on corporations and individuals. So he's another kind of everyday American man kind of guy, the average American, who is pushing for jobs in public works. So he encourages government spending on schools, on highways, on universities, and he wants to see an old age pension enacted. All of these are very common beliefs. But Huey is a little bit obnoxious. I'm going to go ahead and say that. He has a very, very big personality. Um, and he kind of tells people what he thinks indiscriminately. And so he definitely gains a great deal of, um, a large number of enemies. On September 8th of 1935, he gets shot in the state capitol. No one is really sure if it's his own men that kill him or if it's somebody else. So he ends up dying about 2 days later. But within Louisiana, he was revered as almost like a messiah figure. And so I think I think the bridge that goes over the Mississippi is the Huey Long Bridge. But there are definitely a number of things that are named for him within Louisiana. But again, what his message, like Conklin, excuse me, is anti-corporation, anti-big business, um, and all about the ordinary average American. So we got two people already talking about that. And here we talk about Francis Townsend, and this is the Townsend Plan that I mentioned in the previous module. He's a physicist who he comes up with this plan called the Townsend Plan, which is funded by a 2% sales tax, and beneficiaries would receive about $200 a month. There were 3 requirements. The person had to be retired. They had to be, quote unquote, free from habitual criminality, which meant you can't have a criminal record. And the person had to spend the money within 30 days. Townsend never really liked the Social Security plan that Roosevelt puts out there, largely because it was smaller than what he proposed. But the thing about this is that, and the other thing about Social Security under FDR is that you had to work in order to earn it. In this case, what he's calling for is strictly, it would be across the board whether you were covered or not under Social Security. Remember all those exemptions. So it would be regardless of where you worked or if you worked at all. But the interesting thing is that the Townsend Plan is very, very, very popular, and it forces FDR to come up with a suitable arrangement or a suitable substitute for it, which of course he does. But still, there are quite a few people who are not happy with the program as it comes out. The American Liberty League forms in 1934, and these are mostly wealthy businessmen and prominent political opponents of Roosevelt. And this is a bipartisan opposition, so you have Democrats as well as Republicans. But the main source of opposition are regulations on business. Again, this is almost like kind of where they're claiming that the federal government is not supporting free enterprise. And they're claiming that the New Deal is contrary to American ideals in the Constitution. It's un-American, it's socialist, it's communist, it screams of tyranny. What's interesting about this is there's a quote that I will read. It is also not surprising that in the midst of the Great Depression, the movement failed miserably to convince the American people to give millionaires unrestricted freedom to run their businesses. So I think that pretty much sets it up, that this was seen as a wealthy attempt to criticize the New Deal, and it just didn't gain a great deal of ground. And especially after Roosevelt's victory in 1936, the League pretty much kind of fizzles out. Now, the Popular Front is an interesting critic. Basically what happens in the crash of 1929, you had communists calling for the failure of capitalism, that the Great Depression was brought on by the failure of capitalism, and in any day they fully anticipated the workers to rise up as Karl Marx had indicated, and overthrow the bourgeoisie, the people in charge, the wealthy bankers and capitalists. They waited and they waited and they waited. And finally, by 1935, they began to realize the proletariat revolution probably ain't going to happen. So they began to change tactics. Previously, they had gotten involved with other left-wing groups and organizations, and the membership had continued to decline. So by 1939, they decide we're going to diversify our efforts by getting involved with different organizations and political groups and a number of different agendas. So like the civil rights movement, the labor movement, workers' rights, and representing the unemployed. And this is what the Popular Front basically does, is that they get involved in these organizations in order to make the Communist Party more relevant, if you will, or to make it more modern. Members did not always identify themselves as communists, which is ironic, but this is a Communist Party organization. And communism was the defining liturgy of the movement. In other words, they, referred back to the Communist Manifesto. And they also pushed for a closer relationship with the Soviet Union. That's kind of unusual. But they presented themselves as an American organization and began working on different agendas within existing organizations. So they would work with different civil rights groups. They would work within the labor movement in terms of unions. They would work within workers' rights groups. And so they began to kind of spread out rather than kind of contain themselves into one organization. And what this does is it makes communism more appealing to Americans. And think about it this way: America's right in the middle of the Great Depression, and so you've got people within your organization, who are talking to you about how capitalism has failed, and largely, if you're working in a group of unemployed people, you're probably going to agree, as long as you don't use the communist word. So they were very careful not to advertise themselves as communists within these organizations, but they were talking about and espousing communist beliefs, if that makes sense. So it's not that they were trying to be secretive, it's just that they were trying to be a little bit more discreet and encourage other people to join the Popular Front, really without them realizing where the fundamental organization was. So, not surprisingly, you start having an anti-communist crusade in the late 1930s. The House Un-American Activity is formed. Let's try this again. The House Un-American Activities Committee is formed May 26, 1938. In 1938, you have the head of the Federal Theater Project who comes before the House Un-American Activities Committee. And so you start having this kind of development of a communist scare. And rightly so, though, if you really think about it, because a lot of what the New Deal is doing is they're borrowing a lot from the more radical elements of society. And so it's not a far cry for those people who are working within the New Deal to share some of the ideology of the Communist Party, really without them knowing it. But you have these people who are brought before the committee and charged with being communists. Um, in the 1940s, like when World War II starts, you have what they call the Yellow Report, which was listing names of suspected Japanese sympathizers. In 1946, the House Un-American Activities Committee it suggested that they should look into the KKK. However, one member argued that after all, the KKK is an old American institution. Lovely. So that doesn't happen. But what we're seeing here is the beginnings of the Red Scare, especially around the Cold War, which we'll be talking about in the next chapter. So, as I said, FDR is trying to encourage people to think about other things outside of the Great Depression. At least I said that in the last module. And so people find a number of ways to escape the turmoil of the Great Depression. And radio is probably the most popular of those. Of course, FDR uses it for his fireside chats. But in 1920, you had the first licensed radio station in Pittsburgh that was owned by the Westinghouse Corporation. 1921, there are 5 licensed radio stations. By 1924, there were 500. 1930, 40% of households had a radio. By 1940, 83% of households had a radio. You have the first radio network, the National Broadcast Company, which is the same as NBC that is on TV. And you have the rise of corporate sponsorship. And so corporations are beginning to sponsor different programs. And you would have literally not just music, but you would have radio theater, where you would have ensembles who were acting in a studio, and it would broadcast this story or whatever they were doing across the airwaves. Movies come along. Of course, Shirley Temple was the sweetheart of the Great Depression. She began acting at age 3. She retired at 22 in 1950. Walt Disney appears during this period with Mickey Mouse in 1933. The first sound cartoon was Steamboat Willie, which was featuring Mickey. Jimmy Stewart is a popular actor, Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy. You have Cary Grant, Clark Gable, Bette Davis, gangster movies, and you have horror movies. So the movies are really a way for people to get out of the house, go down to the local movie theater, and watch something that will take them away from their troubles. So I want to focus on a couple of movies that were part of this kind of escapist programming. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was released in 1939 by Columbia Pictures, and the director is Frank Capra, who also directed, by the way, It's a Wonderful Life. And Capra was a socialist, and so this is kind of interesting that he comes up here. But one of the things that the movie focuses on is traditional American beliefs in American government. And in this filibuster scene with Jimmy Stewart, he basically is kind of reprimanding Congress for losing the values of America that were so dear to him. And I don't think it's going to play, so I'm going to have to create a link so you'll be able to watch it later. But anyway, so there's that one. The other one is Gone with the Wind. And a lot of people give me a lot of crap about this. But Gone with the Wind was released in '39, starring Vivian Leigh as Scarlett O'Hara. And it's the longest movie known to man, as far as I know, except for maybe Lawrence of Arabia. Whenever a movie has an intermission, that means it's way too long. But the highlight of the film is, or at least the part that I'm highlighting, is the scene where Scarlett O'Hara is out in the fields of Tara, her plantation, and this is following the Civil War, the end of the war. Her family's starving. She's gone through hell and high water, And so she says basically, as God is my witness, I'm going to beat this. I'm going to, um, they're not going to beat me. And, basically it's like this kind of American resolve against the Depression. So think of the Civil War as the Great Depression, and think of Scarlett O'Hara as the average American. And this is what the spirit of this movie is about. It's about overcoming, or at least in this scene, overcoming the hardships and the bad things that have happened. So I'll also share this one as a link, because it's not going to play, so you can watch it after you do the module. So some of the effects of the New Deal on labor. You have widespread growth of union membership, and this creates a problem of how do you organize workers, especially when you have a massive number of workers, so that you can advance workers' rights effectively. And the biggest change for labor is the massive growth in mass production industries that previously, prior to the New Deal, were not active in union membership or who encouraged the open shop model. Now, of course, FDR is not supporting the open shop and encourages, under the Wagner Act, for people to organize. So John Lewis comes along in November 1938 and creates the Committee of Industrial Organizations. And the way he does this is he, first of all, supports workers of any race. So he opens up the CIO to African Americans. And I just lost where I was. Yes, okay. And he encourages the AFL to organize workers in mass production industries along industrial union lines. So organizing based on industry rather than by job. And this is a much more effective way of organizing. And so the CIO and the AFL basically suspends John Lewis and the members of the CIO to where they have to create their own organization. But in 1934, you have labor basically revolting. You have over 2,000 strikes breaking out, basically around the whole idea of wages and working conditions. But the CIO grows exponentially within steel, rubber, meat, automobile, glass, and electrical equipment industries. So and Lewis even gets two major concessions from General Motors and U.S. Steel. So this was seen as a major win for organized labor. And so eventually what you'll have is the AFL having to come back and merge with the CIO. At some point, it's not too far down the future, because Lewis does such a fantastic job in terms of getting concessions from major employers. In terms of women, women are kind of shafted in the Great Depression. And there are several reasons for that, but numero uno is basically if a job comes available, employers typically would hire men over women. And they would do that obviously because men were seen as the breadwinners of the family. And so women were encouraged to stay at home, were encouraged to take care of the house and the children, and allow their men to be able to go out and find a job. One of the organizations that kind of challenges this is the Association of Unemployed Single Women, who are out there trying to get jobs and are unable to get jobs because the men are taking them all. And so they organize in several different cities and lead protests trying to bring awareness to the fact that they are in need of jobs as much as men are. So, you have some women in pretty prominent positions. Frances Perkins is Secretary of Labor, which was a cabinet position. Eleanor Roosevelt is First Lady, Mary McLeod Bethune in the Black Cabinet. Um, Mary McLeod Bethune oversees the National Youth Administration, which was focused on young unmarried women. And it's basically like the CCC, but for young ladies. At least it starts off that way. Eventually, they kind of, the NYA brings in men and women. But again, what they're doing is they're doing job training. They're trying to teach them, typing or cooking or how to do budgets and all of that stuff. And the whole idea is to get them skills in order to allow them to be able to get a job. Native Americans actually there is a Indian New Deal that was largely brought about through the work of John Collier, who was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs from 1933 to 1945. And he's pictured in two of the pictures down at the bottom, the one on the left and the one in the middle. He was born in Atlanta, and he becomes very interested in the plight of the Native Americans. And so he introduces what he calls the Indian New Deal, which is the Indian Reorganization Act. And the goal was to reverse this traditional American program of assimilation. And instead, he wants to strengthen, encourage, and perpetuate the tribes and their historic traditions and culture. He restores the management of the Native American reservation land and the mineral rights back to the Indians, essentially back to the tribes. And so he reestablishes sovereignty and self-government, encouraging the Native Americans to be self-sufficient. Keep in mind, too, that the Indians were part of the CCC, and there were other relief programs in which they were able to participate. But Collier is really kind of a champion for Indian rights. He gets vilified by the Navajo because as part of the AAA, Collier has a number of their cattle slaughtered. And you're dealing with some issues there because it's not only about just livestock, it's also a livelihood for them. And so the Navajo are basically against John Collier from that point forward. So eventually in 1945, he leaves the position, but the Navajo are not real thrilled with him after that point. Hispanic Americans, you have Hoover in the very beginning of the Great Depression. You have calls for deportation. This continues into the New Deal. You have Mexican immigrants who were fleeing to the United States in large number because as bad as things are in the United States, they're worse in other areas of the Americas. The CCC and the WPA hired Mexican Americans for projects. The Farm Security Administration opened up migrant camps. And the FSA did a really good job of, and I mentioned this in the previous module, of photographing these camps. And so we have a very good record of what these look like. In Puerto Rico, you had the Puerto Rico Economic Reconstruction Administration, who is basically the agent for the New Deal in Puerto Rico. So you have WPA, the CCC, the NYA, you have public works projects, hospitals, highways, schools, water treatment facilities, all being built through the New Deal program, funded through the Puerto Rico Economic Reconstruction Administration. So the last group we'll look at are African Americans. And African Americans typically in terms of jobs were the last hired and the first to let go. And so one of the problems you have in the South and really all over the country is that you have a large number of white men who are without jobs. And so in the South, it was very typical for um, black workers to be let go so that an employer could hire a white male. Um, because of this, black workers were 3 times more likely to be on public assistance. But there were some things that were benefits or good things. The WPA, the NYA, and the CCC all give about 10% of their budget to relief for African Americans. 10% isn't that much, but it's actually a lot more than they had ever received before in terms of relief. So there's kind of a good thing and a bad thing. The National Recovery Administration, the people that were writing codes for industries, write them to where it's almost detrimental for African Americans. And so African Americans refer to the National Recovery Administration as the Negro Removal Act, because basically the codes were encouraging white labor to be hired and black labor to not be. But African Americans organized very effectively. They created selective buying programs or boycotts. The picture in the bottom middle is Adam Clayton Powell, who was a pastor in Harlem, who organized a number of these selective buying campaigns in New York City that were very effective. Essentially, he said, if you can't work here, then we're not going to buy here. You're not going to see our money unless you hire at least one African American to work within a store or what have you. The CIO under John Lewis welcomes black workers and supports the black agenda. And then there's the case of the Scottsboro Boys. These were a group of men who were riding a train out west, and they encountered 2 white women on this train. And it was obviously, we're talking about the Great Depression, so people would use the trains to move from one place to another if they didn't have the money to afford a bus ticket or a car, what have you. So these 2 girls, they go through a town in Alabama, and they claim that this group of black men raped them. And this case goes on and on for quite a while, and naturally the boys receive probably the worst defense attorney support that you could ever get, and they're convicted. And so a number of organizations, including the NAACP, begin calling for a fair trial for the Scottsboro Boys. Well, here's where the Popular Front pops in. The Popular Front pays for the attorney, who is, as far as I remember, he's a pretty prominent attorney in New York, who is affiliated with the Communist Party. They pay for this attorney to represent the men. It takes quite a while for them to get, I don't think they're ever actually fully acquitted. One of them commits suicide in jail, and then the others are finally pardoned by the governor, I think, is what happens. But here again is where the Popular Front is using a national case like the Scottsboro Boys to further their agenda in terms of working within civil rights movement to advocate for equality for African Americans within America. So very volatile situation, during the New Deal for African Americans. It's always seen as kind of it's not a period of positive change for African Americans, but incremental change, more or less.